So this paper examines debates around the ethicality of armed struggle, the legitimacy of violent action in liberation struggles. As we know from the ongoing war and genocide in Israel and Palestine, it is an extremely topical one today. But this debate goes back a long way to the early days of Marxist and labor-inspired revolutionary action in the 20s and 30s, and even earlier, of course, through to the 1960s and the era of decolonization. And several films of the 1960s staged the question of anti-colonial violence as a way of creating solidarity in the audience, and indeed gesturing towards the creation of a militant audience. In this sense, these films served an explicitly political function, a way to legitimate anti-colonial violence, and is thus a revolutionary act in itself. The films are also a way of further showing that violence itself is a form of representation. As the anthropologist Neil Whitehead says, representations are part of violence, not just about it. Moreover, such films screened in European cinemas help to show the Western viewer the inherent hypocrisy of Western liberal commentators criticizing anti-colonial violence in the face of the horrifying violence of colonialism. Everything starts from the fact, to paraphrase Frantz Fanon, that colonialism is a violent phenomenon. I mean, his famous sentence is decolonization is a violent phenomenon, but in fact, he starts from the premise that colonialism is a violent phenomenon. Some critics argue that the role of violence in the analysis of Fanon's thought has been overstated and that in fact his main political focus was socialism. And we can discuss this. However, as Robert Young has shown, Fanon specifically elevated violence as a method of achieving liberation because it could be truly revolutionary and not simply replacing one bourgeois ruling class with another. In what follows, I'm going to try to offer some points of comparison between Walter Benjamin, Antonio Gramsci, and Frantz Fanon on the question of violence in subaltern struggles. And here I draw some analogies between violence against a fascist oppressor and violence against a colonial oppressor, partly because the theorization of these three thinkers bears some clear analogies, how they theorize violence, and shows some analogous lines of thinking. Mainly, the violence of the oppressor is never the equivalent to the counter-violence of the oppressed. There's a moral and qualitative distinction between the two. And this is at the basis, I would argue, of all three thinkers. I also, in the second half of the talk, I link the question of anti-colonial violence to the figure of the partisan and the kind of violence that partisans undertook or supported in the course of World War II, which often involved fighting against their countrymen. An example is the Italian resistance, which was historicized later, was thought about later as a civil war. So, Gillo Pontecorvo's film, 1969 film featuring Marlon Brando, Burn, Quemada, presents the various stages in the education of an anti-colonial rebel. We see the evolution of a black slave from colonized to revolutionary leader through the eyes and partly with the help of an English agent, William Walker, who is played by Brando. Walker arrives in the Caribbean island of Quemada as an emissary of the English Royal Sugar Company in search of someone who will initiate a revolt against the Portuguese colonizers, and the period is the 1840s. Walker aims to instigate an anti-colonial rebellion and get rid of the Portuguese, so as to serve the interests of the company, which can then establish a more profitable and tax-free exploitation of the island's sugar plantations, run with the labor of African slaves. Walker sees rebel potential in a lively and spirited enslaved man called José Dolores, who is in the photo. But in order to initiate the slave rebellion, he must first create a sense of anger and spirit of violent retaliation in José. Walker sets about doing so and creates a scene where he insults José's mother to such a point that José, initially quiet and unwilling to contradict a white man, takes up a machete to strike Walker. This pivotal scene pitted the veteran actor Marlon Brando playing Walker against the non-professional actor playing José Evaristo Marquez, a farmer that Pontecorvo had met while filming on location in Colombia. Another epiphanic moment for José comes when he kills a Portuguese soldier for the first time. Seeing his expression of wonder at his use of violence against the feared colonizer, Walker comments knowingly, "See, even the Portuguese can die." As Frantz Fanon puts it, then, I'm sorry, can you read it? Is it very light? The colonized subject thus discovers that his life, his breathing, his heartbeats are the same as the colonist. He discovers that the skin of the colonist is not worth more than the natives, and it must be said that this discovery shakes the world in a very necessary manner. The colonized revolutionary new assurance stems from this. So Pontecorvo locates the coming about of a revolutionary consciousness in this moment of violence, which also coincides with a sudden shedding of fears and inferiority complexes towards the colonizer. It is an account of the decolonization of the self. Throughout the film, Walker treats Jose as his puppet, only to discover at the end that Jose has become very much his own man and refuses any help from Walker, even when Walker offers to free him from certain execution. Jose has already decided, if there is someone who gives you freedom, then it is not freedom. In order for it to be freedom, no one can give it. You must take it yourself. Rather than be set free by the colonizer, even one who is claiming to act in Jose's best interests, he mounts the scaffold and gives himself up to be hanged. Self-sacrifice, the ultimate form of violence, is what will give him liberty and a form of spiritual immortality. While walking to the scaffold, Jose finally has the last word in his struggle against Walker's attempt to dominate him. Inglés, Englishman, you said that civilization belongs to whites, but what civilization until when? The point here seems to be that Jose values his humanity above his bare life, and in his last words prefigures a future devoid of the brutalizing influences of white civilization. Quemada and Pontecorvo's much better known film, The Battle of Algiers, cinematically staged the question of colonial violence in Frantz Fanon. Pontecorvo's film was permeated by the fiercely radical intellectual currents of the 60s and 70s, most prominently Fanon's espousal of violence and anticolonial struggle, and third worldism, a term encompassing various ideologies that had their origins in Marxism, but had evolved to fit the needs of non-European geopolitical situations in contexts of anti-colonial struggles. So South America, Indochina, Algeria, Angola, South Africa, to name just a few. So Fanon believes violence, which played an integral role in many instances of political decolonization, was indispensable in the decolonization of the self from the psychological hegemony of the colonizer. His position on violence was uncompromising. This was the only language the colonizer would understand, and the only means of redemption offered to those who have nothing. Violence is a weapon of the poor. In colonial countries, only the peasantry is revolutionary. It has nothing to lose and everything to gain, says Fanon. The underprivileged and starving peasant is the exploited who very soon discovers that only violence pays. This sentence is echoed nearly word for word in Burn in Quemada, when the agent Walker explains to the businessmen and politicians of Quemada that the only reason they will win their war against the peasant revolt of José Dolores is because of their superiority in weapons and manpower. So as he explains, and this is, Fanon 101, a soldier fights for his pay or because his government forces him to. A guerrilla fights for an idea, and thus is worth 10, 20, 50, 100 times more than the soldier on the battlefield. Something that Carl Schmitt would return to later in his thinking about the partisan. Violence is first and foremost a courage to act against the colonizer, which ensures a form of re-humanization. So this is key to Fanon's thinking, that at the individual level, he says, sorry about that, at the individual level, violence is a cleansing force. It rids the colonized of their inferiority complex, of their passive and despairing attitude. It emboldens them and restores their self-confidence. Violence is a form of restored agency, in other words. The role of violence in liberation struggles can be understood through its historical moment of emergence as a valid method of political struggle, but also as ethical mode of action. In this context, it is determined by the specific circumstances of the Algerian War, something that sometimes gets forgotten, I think, but that sometimes does get forgotten when there's a tendency to fetishize Fanon in post-colonial studies. But The Wretched of the Earth is coming out of particular conjuncture that brought together intellectual and philosophical thinking around the parallel phenomena of fascism and colonialism. In particular, George Sorel's discussion of the state of exception examines it as a condition that is but a more extreme version of state power. Achille Nembe notes that the state of exception, which is often read as an aberration of democracy, has a historical predecessor in the permanent regime of exception that obtained in most colonies of the liberal empires of... yes, I'm sorry, I have made a mistake here. Let me repeat what I was saying, because I've read something too much in advance. So I was saying that The Wretched of the Earth does need to be understood in its historical context as coming out of the Algerian War. And in particular, Fanon is critical of nonviolence. So the essay on violence is really a critique of nonviolence as a typical strategy of the bourgeois colonized elites. He finds it to be equivalent with political compromise with the colonial power. This is why he says violence is a means of rehumanization. The colonized man liberates himself in and through violence. Precisely because colonization is always a violent phenomenon and posits a Manichaean world, that of the oppressor versus that of the oppressed, the only way for the colonized to regain some form of human dignity is through what he calls counter-violence. And here, again, we come back to a discussion we had yesterday, that qualitative distinction between colonial violence and revolutionary violence. And here I come to Walter Benjamin. Benjamin's 1921 essay, Critique of Violence, toward the Critique of Violence, written so many decades before Fanon, can help to understand better, I think, how it is possible to ethically distinguish different forms of political violence. After all, how is the violence of the Algerians superior to that of the French army that is trying to suppress them? And in Benjamin's essay, we can find the beginnings of an answer. Jacques Derrida offers a detailed commentary on Benjamin's essay, and he thinks about the essay's title, Toward the Critique of Violence. He says, critique doesn't just mean negative evaluation, legitimate rejection or condemnation of violence, but judgment, evaluation, examination that provides itself with the means to judge violence. So, but Benjamin is not just critiquing violence, he is evaluating it. And in fact, he starts his essay by saying, the task of a critique of violence may be described as the presentation to its relation to law and justice. But he is careful to add, and this is the crux of his argument, that the issue at stake is not whether violence is a moral means to a just end. The issue at stake is whether there is a place for a revolutionary cleansing violence, to paraphrase Fanon, to use that word that he was using in his essay, that can distance itself morally and politically from a legal system and a state that lay claim to a monopoly on all forms of violence. So he is saying, is there a space for revolutionary violence? Fanon's espousal of violent struggle in the context of the Algerian War is both pragmatic and philosophical. The philosophical roots of Fanon's position can be traced back to anti-fascism on the one hand, and the support for Marxist revolutionary violence in George Sorel on the other. The Holocaust survivor, who wrote memoirs about his time in Auschwitz, connects the two strands of thinking about violence in his discussion of ressentiment, the feeling of rancor and wish for vengeance towards the Nazi officials who tortured him in captivity. So we move a little bit to Améry, to Georges Améry. He connects these two strands of thinking in the way that he thinks about the concept of ressentiment, the feeling of rancor and wish for vengeance towards the Nazi officials who tortured him in captivity. For Améry, the punishment of the perpetrators makes them morally akin to the victims, and finally restores a sense of humanity to both individuals. So he is greatly indebted to Fanon here. When SS man Weiss stood before the firing squad, he experienced the moral truth of his crimes. At that moment, he was with me, and I was no longer alone with his shovel handle. I would like to believe that at the instant of execution, the anti-man had once again become a fellow man. In Fanon, we find a strikingly similar observation. For the colonized, life can only materialize from the rotting cadaver of the colonist. Améry's reading of Fanon makes a sharp distinction again between the violence of the perpetrators and that of the victims. There is no symmetry between the two positions. And he introduces the concept of revolutionary violence, which we find also in Benjamin's writing. Revolutionary violence, he says, is the affirmation of the self-realizing being against the negation, the denial of the human being. And so he talks about repressive violence as blocking the way to the self-realization of the human being. Revolutionary violence breaks through. So again, it's that form of rehumanization that Fanon has been talking about. So it helps, I think, to see, sorry, I'm going too much ahead here, the link between fascist and colonial violence, because it helps us to understand that relationship between colonized subjects of imperial power and the popularization of fascism within Europe. And of course, we know the argument about Césaire thinking about fascism as revolted against the heart of Europe. This is a lesson that he takes from Césaire. It is the problem of humanism, of course, then, that Fanon takes up in his writing. So he's interested in what is a new notion of the human. When we heard already this term of the sort of the striptease, the striptease of European humanism lays bare the racism at the heart of it. It then becomes possible to identify decolonization, a process that affects Europe as much as the colonies. That is to say that the settler, which is in every one of us, is being savagely rooted out. So when Sartre says this book is not for Europeans, what he's saying is we have to listen to it from afar. We have to listen to it in terms of how we can root out the colonial savagery from ourselves as European selves. And for me, I think this is one of the tasks of post-colonial studies, that it is very much about self-critique, as much as it is about analyzing what was happening in the colonies. So for Fanon, the utter dehumanization of the individual in fascism and colonialism is affected by means of racialization. Unsurprisingly, when Améry draws on Fanon for his memoir writing about the Holocaust, we find resonances of these two, of this new idea of humanism, and also a new, different kind of violence. The violence needed to turn camp inmates or the colonized back into human beings is identified by revolutionary violence, which actually he calls messianic. So here we have a resonance with Benjamin. I would argue that Benjamin's idea of violence is also understood as a rehumanizing force. He says here, it refers and leads to the more than temporal, the historical, humane future. Again, Améry is using that word, humane. He's gesturing to the humanistic valence of a violence that operates beyond the usual historical cycle of violent regimes or governments that succeed one another. Each new regime installs the state through an active force over the previous oppressor. But for Fanon, the violence of the colonizer is not merely a new moment in the endless cycle, but it is the violence to end violence, more like a utopian wish to close the chapter on colonial violence in the hope of heralding a new humanism. And these are words of Mamdani, not of my own. So Améry's revolutionary violence resonates closely with Benjamin's enigmatic notion of divine violence, a violence that operates beyond rather than outside the law and is intimately connected to the problem of justice. This violence seeks to do away altogether with the necessity for law, as law is inherently linked to violence and thus stops short of reaching true justice. Jacques Derrida and George Agamben both read Benjamin's idea of violence, of divine violence, as the founding act of a world where law will no longer be necessary and justice will reign. Indeed, a messianic form of violence. This violence does not merely reinstate another victorious rule of law, which will substitute that of the vanquished state, just as the purpose of anti-colonial violence in Fanon's thinking is not that of setting up new oppressors in the form of neocolonial elites. And here I'm quoting from Derrida's sort of gloss on Benjamin's essay. This violence is linked to an ideal of justice that is to come, avenir. Justice, insofar as it is not only a juridical or political concept, opens up for l'avenir, the future, the transformation, the recasting or refounding of law and politics. We can see parallels here with Fanon's concept of a new humanism, and maybe we can discuss this in the Q&A. Benjamin states that the ethical dilemma raised by the use of violence as a moral means to a just end is not properly formulated. He says it is important instead to look at violence in the realm of means. The state sees the use of violence by individuals outside the law as a danger undermining the legal system. He remarks how in the First World War, the critique of military violence led to a passionate critique of violence in general. So this is the pacifism, right, that accompanied the First World War. He defines military conscription as the compulsory, universal use of violence as a means to the ends of the state. But a critique of this violence on the basis of pacifism does not get to the heart of the matter. And he also critiques nonviolence for the same reason, interestingly, in a move that is similar to that of Fanon. He says, rather, you can read that, Rather, such a critique of violence coincides with the critique of all legal violence, that is, the critique of legal or executive power, and is not to be accomplished with a less ambitious program. So, critics have remarked on the ambiguity of the word Gewalt, of the German term Gewalt, which I'm not a Germanist and I do not know German, but my understanding from what I've read is that it means both violence and legitimate power, authority, public force, and I'm sure it has a host of other meanings. But it has that dual meaning of violence and power, which is interesting in this essay. So in this sense, what it's trying to do is to disentangle violence from the law, violence from the use of power, to articulate these different meanings that it can have in relationship to political emancipation. And here the contextualization of Benjamin's essay becomes important. The aftermath of First World War, the political and economic instability of Germany during the Weimar Republic, and the Russian Revolution, well, not the Weimar Republic, the Russian Revolution are the backdrop to this 1921 peace. Both militarism and the increasing centrality of the police in European states seem particularly relevant to Benjamin's focus on the law-making and law-preserving violence that forms the backbone of state power. Benjamin is a harsh critic of parliamentary democracy, where the excesses of state power are seen as less forgivable than in an absolute monarchy. It is not always easy to distinguish between revolutionary violence and what Benjamin calls a law-making violence that aims to set up a new system of inequalities and force in place of the previous one. Nevertheless, Benjamin's line of thinking opens up a space for a better understanding of Fanon's position, and he shares many points in common with Benjamin on the role of political violence. As Robert Young argues, colonial rule was merely the legitimation of an originary colonial violence. Sartre synthesized the two, Benjamin and Fanon, to argue that colonial violence is merely an after effect of the founding violence of the bourgeois metropolitan state, which continues to repeat through its remote anarchic offspring. So Fanon, as a psychiatrist in Algeria in the 1950s, observed the effects of torture on both perpetrator and victim. But he also saw torture as intrinsic to the colonial state machinery and not an aberration of it. He thus found hypocritical the horrified reaction of the French public to allegations of torture made against colonial officers and policemen. He said, "One cannot be in favor of the maintenance of French domination in Algeria and opposed to the means that its maintenance requires." So, as Benjamin focuses on violence as a means without regard to the legality of its ends, so too, for Fanon, the validity of violence in liberation struggles is not solely regarded as a means to achieve liberation from the colonizer and oppressor. Rather, violence is seen as an end in itself. For Fanon, it functions as, quote, a psychotherapy of the oppressed, to quote from Young. So if and psychotherapy is a word that Young uses advisedly, because he's thinking, of course, of Fanon's profession. So if decolonization is what makes the colonized a human being, then violence here is not merely a means to an end, it is the process by which the colonized becomes human. Fanon thinks that violence is what restores agency to the oppressed. He was highly criticized. The essay was, of course, received very diversely. And Hannah Arendt famously condemned Fanon's glorification of violence for its own sake. She was so provoked by the argument of the wretched of the earth that she wrote a short book called On Violence in 1970 as a partial response both to Sartre and Fanon. She said, "Violence will be justifiable, but it will never be legitimate." And I think, again, it's interesting that use of justifiability versus legitimacy, which is exactly the heart of Benjamin's essay as well. And she's going back to Marx, and she says, that she feels that Fanon had fundamentally misunderstood Marx on the question of violence. She says, she said, they have both reappropriated this idea of man recreating himself, humanism, which was in the tradition of Hegelian and Marxian thinking, and at the very basis of a leftist humanism. However, she says, Hegel saw man producing himself through thought, whereas for Marx, it was labor that fulfilled this function. Though one may argue that all notions of man creating himself have in common a rebellion against the very effectuality of the human condition, still it cannot be denied that a gulf separates the essential peaceful activities of thinking and laboring from all deeds of violence. To shoot down a European is to kill two birds with one stone. There remain a dead man and a free man, says Sartre in his preface to Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. This is a sentence that Marx could never have written. But Fanon does take Marx as his starting point to show how the colonized can claw their way back into a human dimension through a form of counter-violence directed against their oppressor. It is important to note that in Fanon, and not even in Pontecorvo, I would argue, if we look at his films, there is an aestheticizing glorification of violence. It is justified because it is part of a very clear program of resistance and serves as a way to create a common unity among the colonized. So when Arendt says that violence can be justified but never can be legitimate, she grasps at an important truth of Fanon's point of view, but also that of Benjamin. Fanon is not interested in legitimation. Since the law has been used as a tool of oppression against the colonized, there is no reason to respect it any longer. Fanon assigns a positive and creative role to violence in the anti-colonial struggle. As a psychiatrist, for Fanon, violence could form part of a process of healing. And Jung likens his idea of revolutionary violence to a surgical intervention. At the same time, it acts as a form of political mobilization for the colonized. So we turn a little bit now to Benjamin. Toward a critique of violence, Benjamin considers the strike a form of violence following George Sorel's teachings. Though it is not violent in and of itself, the right to strike is a form of extortion that labor organizations, aka unions or labor organizations of any kind, demand from the state. And in this sense, here quoting from the point, the right to strike in the view of organized labor, which is opposed to the view of the state, constitutes the right to use violence for the implementation of certain ends. Duncan Stewart, this is a quote, just again it's cut off, but Duncan Stewart notes that in the final section of the essay, Benjamin suggests that a general strike provides a model for a form of violence that breaks with the ancient model of fate. The law will never sanction a general strike because it challenges the whole system and is therefore implicitly and sometimes explicitly revolutionary. General strikes represent a threat to the law as such in exactly the same way that conventionally understood violence does. So strike is profoundly violent, even though it is not shedding bloodshed. Fanon theorizes that in the Algerian War, the FLN used both general strikes and violence directed again at the French as a means to bring the people together. In fact, if we look at the Battle of Algiers, the general strike is a very prominent episode in the film. It takes over the whole Kasbah. It was a form of what we might call partisan violence. Partisan violence has much in common with class struggle, of course, the way Gramsci theorized it in the notebooks. And again, class struggle and political struggle in Gramsci is likened to anti-colonial struggle in the notebooks. So he talks specifically about the Indian nationalist movement, the Indian nationalist struggle, to understand that relationship between political struggle and military war. So I'm introducing the third thinker without introducing him properly. So he's saying, in order to understand political struggle and thinking about class struggle, in fact, you can understand it through a comparison with colonial wars, or what he calls old wars of conquest, where military conquest is followed by prolonged resistance that may assume different forms and modalities. The political struggle in India against the English is a paradigmatic case in one's understanding of the political struggle, as it simultaneously assumes three different forms of war: war of movement, war of position, and underground warfare. So Gramsci thinks of Gandhi's passive resistance in movements like the non-cooperation movement that included strategies like boycott as a war of position. It becomes a war of movement through strategies like the strike, and at other times, underground warfare through the secret preparation of weapons and combat troops. And this passage cannot simply be dismissed as a sort of marginal entry into an otherwise quite Eurocentric text. In fact, he gives an importance to the colonial paradigm for understanding how political struggle was working in his world. So it's not just, the colonial location is not an additive to larger historical narratives, but it is a paradigmatic case in itself. Colonial locations such as India and Ireland are quite central to Gramsci's formulation of war and political struggle. And of course, if we think about the idea of the South, which is exported from Sardinia outwards in Gramsci's thinking, we see how the colonial location is very prominent in his thinking. And again, we've already discussed at length the figure of the subaltern and how easily it has been co-opted by post-colonial thought, given its obvious applicability to colonial situations, because it was already in Gramsci's text. And finally, I come to the final sort of discussion of my talk, the final section of my talk, where we think about the subaltern, how he or she becomes a protagonist of anti-colonial struggles in the 1930s, and further on in the era of decolonization. So I like to link the idea of the partisan in the 1930s, and of course during the Second World War, of the anti-fascist resistance to the moment of third worldism, the moment of decolonization. So in this final section of the paper, I discuss how partisan violence and its theorization are clearly linked to Benjamin's critique of violence. Above all, his 1921 essay was a critique of the law. As Peter Fenves notes, for Benjamin, there is no mediating third term between the law and justice. Legal order is premised on law-making violence. Anti-colonial violence, as theorized by Fanon, was a complete overthrow not only of the colonial system, but also of European capitalist society. The conservative philosopher Carl Schmitt clearly grasped the inherent danger in anti-colonial revolution and saw its relation to Benjamin's divine or revolutionary violence, though he does not nominate it as such. For Schmitt, the end of the world order ushered in by anti-colonial revolution is symbolized by the figure of the partisan. Lacking a sense of territoriality, lacking a sense of insignia, the partisan does not belong to a regular army and often fights against their own compatriots. Schmitt's theory of the partisan was, unsurprisingly, an essay he wrote based on 2 lectures that he delivered in 1962 at universities in Francoist Spain. He was invited to give these lectures in Spain under Franco, and I think this is so important to the understanding of this essay. He examines the partisan as representative of a new global politics emerging out of third world revolutionary struggles of the period, such as Cuba, Algeria, and China, to give 3 examples. For Schmitt, the end of the liberal order is exemplified by the guerrilla warfare that grew out of international communism and decolonization. Because the partisan is fighting in the name of an idea rather than as a member of a regular army, he is beyond all normative regulation. Schmitt defines the partisan as an irregular combatant and the polar opposite to the enlisted soldier. The modern partisan is essentially a political combatant, and partisan warfare is different from interstate war because it is a form of civil war, which is fought for a political cause, such as communist revolution or anti-colonial struggle. To be a partisan, according to Schmitt, is precisely to avoid carrying weapons openly. The partisan being the one who fights from ambushes, who wears the enemy uniform, and whatever insignia serves his turn, as well as civilian clothing as decoys. In emphasizing the political role of partisan combat, Schmitt was drawing on Ernesto Che Guevara's theorization of guerrilla warfare. Che emphasized that the guerrillas cannot forget their function as vanguard of the people, their mandate, and as such, they must create the necessary political conditions for the establishment of revolutionary power based on the support of the masses. In the revolution, the struggle is both political and military, and it must be developed and understood as such. So Schmidt highlights the difficulty in assigning a precise juridical status to the partisan, because the partisan blurs the distinctions between friend and enemy, as such are categorized in ordinary warfare between nation states. And again, we can think of lots of examples from the European resistance. Schmidt argues that Lenin first theorized that partisan warfare identifies an absolute enemy, namely the Western capitalist, as opposed to the conventional enemy of interstate conflicts. According to Schmidt, the irregularity of class struggle, that's what he calls it irregular, exemplified by partisan warfare, provoked the destruction of the Eurocentric world, culminating in the 1960s with the wars of decolonization. So he's seeing this whole process from a conservative point of view, which is very interesting actually to see it from that perspective. And particularly striking are his examples of irregular. Who are these irregular combatants? His examples are Third World communists, so Mao, Che Guevara, and the colonialist French general Raoul Salan. So Salan, again, returns us back to that politics of memory that we were talking about yesterday. Salan fought to keep Algeria French and founded the right-wing terrorist organization Organisation Armée Secrète that attempted a coup against President de Gaulle. There is a telluric or territorial element to Schmidt's theory of partisan warfare, namely a devotion to one's nation that becomes all the stronger once this nation is seen to be under threat. Sorry, I realize I'm getting close to I'm almost done. Another word for a partisan could be a patriot, albeit without a regular army. Salan desired to prevent Algeria from becoming independent at all costs, to the point of instigating terrorist attacks against his own fellow citizens in France. He's bringing the Civil War home. Schmidt recalls with admiration how Salan recoded these acts of extreme patriotism in defense of France's national sovereignty, which extended to the colony. Schmidt's ideal partisan, needless to say, is of course conservative. Salan was a right-wing activist who learned much from the Third World anti-colonial combatants that he had himself encountered in Indochina when he fought there. Unsurprisingly, given Schmidt's fascist sympathies, theory of the partisan lacks any mention of anti-fascist resistance movements. It's like the obvious referent, but he doesn't talk about that. Schmidt even omits details of Salan's early experiences as a member of the French resistance. He only talks about what he did for Algeria, against Algeria. So, despite the obvious differences in political outlook, Schmidt's idea of the partisan as political combatant can be linked to Gramsci's notion of subaltern struggle. In the notebooks, as I've discussed, this is conceived not only as class struggle, but as anti-imperialist struggle. But my use of the term partisan here departs from Schmidt's because I would assign positive values to camouflage and irregularity, which he considers key to the partisan warfare that transcends borders and poses a threat to regular armies. I suggest that these traits of irregularity and camouflage characterize transnational resistance in the interwar period. Resistance in Gramsci emerges as a form of internal dissidence to fascism, which had imprisoned him, but also to empire, that found expression in the anti-colonial solidarity with oppressed nations. So Italy, like Ethiopia. Oppressed Italy, like oppressed Ethiopia. So just to sort of conclude, the transnational partisan is a crucial figure, I would say, of the 20th century fight against fascism and colonialism. The partisan's heuristic potential for joining up these diverse accounts of struggles across the colonial divide can allow us to produce a more interconnected narrative of global resistance. And engaged intellectuals like Benjamin, Fanon, and Gramsci are partisans by definition. As Gramsci famously remarked in 1917, I believe, like Federico Hebel, that to live means being a partisan. Those who truly live cannot be but citizens and partisans. Indifference is a voglia, it is parasitism, it is cowardice, it is not living. Therefore, I hate the indifferent. Indifference is the dead weight of history. Indifference operates powerfully in history. It operates passively, but it operates. It is fatality. It is what cannot be counted on. It is what upsets programs, overturns the best laid plans. It is the brute matter that throttles intelligence. I'm going to end with Gramsci. I hope I kept to time. So.
Thank you, Neelam. All right.
Thank you so much, Neelam. It was great. I have a question about when you made the comparison between Améry and Fanon about how the death of the colonizer or of the Nazi officer is also the revitalization of the oppressed or of the colonized. But there was a kind of a difference between, because Améry claims that in the moment that of execution, the Nazi might become a fellow man again. So in this violence, this counter-violence, not only the oppressed is liberated, but also the oppressor. And in the at least in the quote from Fanon, there's not this this moment of also liberating the colonizer. So do you see that that's also present in Fanon in other parts of his work? Or is it more like he's not interested in this moment, also because of the historical circumstances, in liberating the oppressor as well?
I think he's pretty uncompromising on that question. I mean, I don't, at least, I mean, certainly I don't think in On Violence, and I don't think in the other essays there's ever any, he doesn't concede any quarter to. He is not like Améry. Yeah, there's a distinction. That's a really good point. He doesn't allow that moment of humanity, even at the moment of death, to the oppressor. So yeah, that I think is a difference. And because Améry's text comes afterwards, I think that there's something that Améry is evolving, or not evolving. That's not the word, but transforming of Fanon's thought. Yeah, that is a very good point. But again, Fanon's first struggles were actually anti-fascist because he fights for the French, the Free French. It's such a, again, that question of memory, of what you are fighting for and who you are fighting for. He first fights for the Free French in Martinique. He leaves the island because part of it was occupied by a Vichy sort of regime, and then he's trying to join the British and the French, and then he goes, and it is almost a return, not a return, but there is a connection. It's not by chance, I think, that Améry is going to Fanon. But thanks, that's a really good point.
Okay, this maybe I'll leave it for the round table because I was trying to think of what you were just saying and searching for quotes. I cannot find it. So, Neelam, it was amazing, really cool. I cannot, I think I don't have to make the artificial exercise of disagreeing because I agree with everything you said. So maybe just some selfish question in the sense that I will really extractivist question to try to see if, and a comment. So the extractivist question, I'm trying to think about a problem that maybe I have when I deal with which is indeed what you highlighted, that besides the fact that there are very specific traits and features that are attributed to the partisan, its irregularity, so the irregularity of its figure, of its combatant figure, then the partisan can be Che, or can be an anti-colonial fighter, but can also be Salan. And this is where it seems that, maybe we should move toward a partisan theory of partisanship, because I feel the need of expelling the possibility of using partisan for naming Salan. Otherwise, it becomes an indifferent concept, if you see what I mean. So, and I'm thinking how to do that. I don't have an answer, because of course one could say, well, not Salan was not a partisan. Right, we can do it, like empirical expulsion. But I'm wondering if there's a way in which we can, and yesterday, again, one of this conversation that we had, that you were saying something relevant about, you recall it like the non-telluric, like the different belonging, maybe. There is a transnational and not a filiation from the land to which one belongs. Because
absolutely.
I don't know if along the lines of this, and this comes from you, it doesn't come from me, I'm just repeating what I'm saying, so I don't want to claim, but I'm wondering if we can think about how conceptually expel the possibility of considering Salan a partisan, in order to come up with a partisan theory of partisanship. So not necessarily Schmitt, but how do we clarify the part of the partisan, the camp of the partisan, the only side on which the partisan can stand, because I don't think that partisan can be anywhere, or otherwise we have a problem with this concept.
No, absolutely.
Sorry.
Yeah.
A similar, although different question then, so I guess the partisan theory of violence that we have in Benjamin, then I'm a bit maybe puzzled or confused by this, of course, law and justice, because I'm thinking that what I was trying to argue is that, for me, Benjamin's take on violence would be on the side of redemption. I try to say that post-colonial justice adopts a different logic. Maybe because I'm limited in the sense that I'm indeed thinking of justice like law, taking it from debate on post-colonial reparation that somehow mobilize a notion of justice, which is how the law repaired the tort. So it's really... So maybe sorry, this is my problem. So I'm like, why I'm asking you to solve it? But the question is whether justice is, for Benjamin, clearly you can play justice versus the law and subvert the law and oppose the law. Revolutionize law through justice. But I'm wondering if this is what is at stake. This is actually what's happening in Benjamin. This idea that beyond the law rather than outside the law, this divine violence come up with an establishment of violence. So, I don't know, this is just a confused thought. I'm trying to make sense of what I was earlier saying. Law and violence are clearly distinguished in Benjamin to the point that law only sides with the, monopoly of violence somehow. It's only state law.
Yeah.
And then justice would be completely on the other side.
Well, the essay is very... Oh, sorry, you wanted to finish. Sorry,
at the last, because then I throw it. Then maybe the last comment would be on this humanist thing, because I guess you mentioned that, and now Mariana came back to this question of, what is destroyed through anti-colonial violence? Well, is it just the colonizer, or it's just the colonized that is dead, but there's also like a regeneration or palingenesis of man. Yeah. In a sort of absolute sense, not just regenerating or restoring the self-confidence and the agency and the very status of being of the dehumanized, colonized. Maybe, I would have, but I couldn't find a tendency to think that there is more that happens through anti-colonial violence. So like there is a new humanity which is established, and that's also, let's say, a gift to the colonizer. Not that one has to bring a gift to the colonizer, but, there's something more generous. By abolishing colonial rule, the purpose is not to liberate the colonizer, but what is happening is really this palingenesis where new humanity is brought about, and this is also something that would radically, even the colonizer would benefit of this regeneration somehow. I don't know if this makes sense.
For sure.
And this against all the sort of humanist reading of Fanon that I think are completely misleading, because this humanist dimension in Fanon is quite relevant, of course, of a different humanism. The striptease of European humanism, they bring about a radically different humanism, of which it does not provide empirical description, but it's clearly using this word, and I think we should take him seriously rather than disconnecting completely from this humanist tradition.
Absolutely. Can I just, is it okay to answer? So thank you so much, Jamila. These are like three really great points. I'm kind of obsessed with the Schmidt essay. I've been reading it and rereading it for a while now and trying to make sense of it. And I have to say, I probably need to read all of Schmidt before I can understand, because the friend-enemy distinction is something that, of course, he elaborates a lot on. But the question you asked is a really good one, is like, how do you avoid this just becoming a sort of portable concept that can be applied indifferently? I think the difference is exactly in that word telluric. Okay, so he talks about the territorial aspect of partisanship. He links it to territory, and he says Salan's territory was France. The territory of the global partisan, of Mao, of Che Guevara, of the other revolutionaries, was the globe. So it's the earth, right? It's a global civil war. It's not linked to a specific territory. It's territorial, but it's the earth. So that's the difference that Salan is thinking about France. He wants that to, maybe the colonizer has this fantasy that everything becomes a French empire, fine, but that's a different story. But the difference between Salan and Mao, but Che Guevara, let's say, rather Mao, maybe a slightly more problematic figure. But the difference between Che Guevara and Salan is that Che Guevara's whole terrain of struggle, so he says explicitly in the essay, the whole terrain of struggle is the world, is the globe. And for Salan, it was the territory of France. And that's what Schmidt doesn't understand. I mean, he makes a good point. I think he grasps that distinction, but he doesn't understand the sort of ethical difference between the two figures. Yeah? I mean, it's clear that, so how come he completely doesn't mention Salan's, fighting in the French resistance? He only mentions the fact that he's protecting France, but he doesn't want to mention those anti-fascist ideals that are much more universalizing than fascism, than sort of, I suppose, like nationalist imperialism, I guess you could say. I think that's the difference. He grasps something interesting. That's why the essay has some useful value, but then he limits it. And about the question of law and justice, and of course, that essay is hugely complicated, and we have Benjaminians in the room who will have a much better understanding of the essay. I read it and again reread it, trying to make sense of it. It's very enigmatic at the end, because Benjamin is distinguishing between this lawmaking and law-preserving violence, and he says, how do we break this? This cycle? And he, at the end of the essay, he becomes very prophetic and cryptic and talks about messianic violence and divine violence and mythic violence. And, well, mythic violence is still connected to the law, right? So the myths that he talks about, Niobe and others, are connected to lawmaking, and he's thinking about Roman law. But then when he gets to divine violence, it seems that it's clear that he's thinking about things like the revolutionary strike, like the revolutionary general strike, and he's thinking about revolutionary violence, and he doesn't call it such. And in that sense, then my sense is that kind of violence, the divine violence, would be the establishment of justice, is the realm of justice. But again, obviously, that was my reading of the essay and of the other commentaries that I read around the essay. The quote from Derrida, that revolutionary violence is linked to an ideal of justice that is to come. And again, you will know Derrida much better than me, but again, the futurity of it, the avenir, is messianic, right? It's something that is to come, the coming of, which is, but he says that violence itself has what was the third? The point about the humanism. And I think Fanon is wanting to say. I think Sartre then has a good commentary on Fanon. Fanon's manual is for those who are undertaking the revolution, but the book is read by those who are not in the revolution as well. And it does help to decolonize. Like, it's a decolonizing practice to read the book, right? So yes, it's interesting he himself never fired a weapon, right? Like, he himself isn't a combatant in the FLN. He's doing other kinds of work, right? And part of his work is writing this book that we read. And that is a form of partisanship in itself. So he is trying to make us think of a new humanism, I think. And why is it that decolonizing practices are so important now in Europe? They are important here. I'm saying obvious and banal things, but decolonizing is a form of rehumanization of the colonizer, of understanding what makes you less human. I don't know, sorry. I feel like I'm preaching, but I don't want to preach. I didn't mean to have this, but I don't know, it's a good, but thank you for other questions.
Thank you, and my question was linked to the distinction between lawmaking violence and divine violence, messianic violence. Because I agree with everything you said, but still I think it remains the problem of, my problem with Benjamin is saying not what you said, with the distinction between these two kinds of violence, because on the one hand we have the loop of law-making violence or law-preserving violence, and on the other hand it seems that there is this extra violence that is not a relationship of means to end, but a means in itself that should bring something completely new and dismissing this loop of creating the state that will establish its own, the law of its preservation as de facto a violence, because I think in this essay Benjamin is in depth with the work of Landauer, who was an anarchist socialist, and who wrote an essay, a plea to socialism, where he was thematizing the fact that lawmaking violence was the result actually of revolution itself. Because when you make a revolution, then you have to establish a state, and once you have established that you have the problem that there is the law-preserving violence, and the discontent with this will reach a point that a new revolution will come, but will still not dismiss the circle, the loop. No, so how can, because since it has a human cost, I mean that we're not talking about abstract things. How can we decide when it's that the violence I am enacting is a messianic violence, and how can I be sure that it will not bring to another law-preserving violence, law-making violence, and so on? Because I think that it is, as you've shown, there is a performative aspect of violence in creating the subject of struggle. So I cannot know in advance that my violence will bring to an end this circle, and in any case I have to establish something at the end, because it's not that I have a Sorelian general strike, nihilism, and then there's
yeah. I mean, I suppose that's the big question of the essay. I wonder if, I think that's obviously that's the big question, well, of the readers of the essay, because my sense is that Benjamin, despite the cryptic language that he uses, has that distinction very clearly in mind. And I wonder whether he was thinking of, again, a bit as in Fanon, he's not universalizing, but he's slightly abstracting specific historical examples that were in front of him. I mean, he is probably thinking about historical events that happened at the time in which he was writing his essay, and that those could be examples of messianic violence, or could possibly, like he was maybe putting his trust in certain things that he was seeing happen, that he felt that this could be an example of messianic violence, and others were not. So this has to do, I suppose, with revolutionary practice, and how do you, I mean, you just don't know. These are both, I mean, Benjamin and Fanon and Gramsci are thinkers who are thinking about the future, but they never saw the future, right? They never saw the end of it. Again, Fanon is also accused of optimism in such a way, like that the essay was written in 1961, or that book was written in 1961, but he never lived to see what decolonization actually looked like. Personally, I don't know that we should read these essays as manuals or as revolutionary manuals. They are philosophical texts, and as such, they probably perform a different function, I think, from, say, for example, Che Guevara's Manual of Guerrilla Warfare. That, I'm sure, contains many philosophical elements in it. So I think also that you can get it wrong, for sure. That that messianic violence, what seems like messianic or divine violence, or the revolution to end revolutions, is not that, in fact. I think also, maybe I'm reading also Benjamin a lot through Agamben, because Agamben is obsessed with this idea of that, future world, of the future community that is yet to come, where justice will be restored. He also speaks very much in the future tense. I'm sorry, I'm not answering your question at all.
No,
but I'm thinking more about the form. I mean, I think it's also maybe also the form of the essay, right? Yeah. That he writes it like a messianic text, in a way. If you read it, again, I don't read German, but
it was an open question, not that you have
yeah.
Benjamin problem.
But yeah, it's a very good question, for sure.
Isn't maybe one solution is just to stop worrying about it, in a sense? I mean, this quote makes me think that perhaps it's more like the difference between messianic and lawmaking violence is just when does it appear? I mean, is it the first one that is messianic because there is not law yet, but it's not separated from law, it just establishes it in advance. So it's, in a sense, messianic is already lawmaking. It will, I mean, it just institutes a new, it's just reinstitution of justice, but it's not so. It's not something that is, there is some law behind it, it's justice in a sense. So,
I mean, you don't need the law anymore.
Maybe it necessarily becomes necessarily, not that it degenerates, but it logically necessarily becomes lawmaking, because when this I mean, the only reason why it appears, messianic appears good and the lawmaking appears bad is because, okay, when the new order is instituted, it is in a way truer, more authentic, because it's very emergence, the proof of its,
But also lawmaking can be revolutionary.
Okay, yeah.
That's not the point. The point is to dismiss this
yeah, but maybe we cannot.
To dismiss the fact that lawmaking violence is an end to create something that then has to preserve itself with other violence. That is the problem, I think, because to interrupt the circle of means to end, you have to.
And what you were saying was more
basically, it's not a difference in kind; it's a difference in aspect, or maybe just
in aspect
the
or
first.
in time. Because
I mean, there is
there's the pars destruens, and then the pars construens would be the pars destruens would be the cleansing violence, divine messianic violence, and the pars consequens would be the establishment.
Yes,
of the law, but it shouldn't be just restoring
yes.
the law. I mean,
yeah, but it establishes the law, so to say. But when it establishes, of course, it's a different kind. I mean, but it's the same. Well, I would say that the messianic is just the moment of appearance, and that's the quality.
But it's also the qualitative difference, right? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, I mean, it's the qualitative in a sense that it's the beginning, and there is only one, and there can only be one beginning of a thing, and then it necessarily loses immediacy or something like that. But definitely it changes, but I think it changes in a way that there's no way to avoid it, because it just. So it's not something that. My point is that we cannot map it onto some desired good or bad or something like that, because it's.
No, but it is also the difference between. I mean, because I've worked with visual or literary examples, but if you look at the Battle of Algiers, it's very clear the way the film is staged that the Algerians' violence is completely justified.
Yeah.
And in that sense, there's a difference between the violence of the French and the violence of the Algerians. And in that sense, I think Benjamin's essay helps, because what the French are doing is not the same thing as what the Algerians are doing. And it's so, you show that, you see a scene where the Algerians had to blow up a cafe with children and all that. And Pontecorvo didn't want to take that scene out, because he said, we need to show it in its full complexity, what is happening here. And again, it raises ethical questions, but at the same time, you understand why they did it. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's breaking the colonial logic, because the liberal critique of empire is, they went too far, right? The torturers, they went too far, and when Mathieu says, well, what else do you want to do? You want to keep Algeria French, and you've got to let us do it. And the police state doesn't end. It extends to the colony, and here that distinction, because Benjamin says there's no distinction in the policeman's mind between lawmaking and law preserving. So when the policeman imparts the law, he makes an instant decision that this person is committing a crime or whatever. He's literally making it up as he goes along. So he's applying the law, but he's making the law at the same time. In the colony, it's a police state. It happens routinely. So in that sense, I think that the film shows that distinction very clearly. It is about distinguishing. It is also about a qualitative distinction, I think, that the essay helps us understand.
Maybe another question, but I feel. I mean, it's a bit circular in the sense that the question of, so you were mentioning how Derrida, commenting on Benjamin, is trying to say that actually towards a critique of violence is an attempt at providing, let's say, the tools for assessing. It's about judging violence, evaluating or assessing. I don't remember now. And then I'm wondering, in that case, it's not I would say that we're assessing violence in order to distinguishing cleansing violence from oppressing violence. What changes, it's not, what makes the distinction is not the ends, or rather, it's not the ends that justify the means. Is it the partisan standpoint that justify the means and the ends? Because what would allow to assess, like the good ends that would allow us to distinguish when violence is actually good because it's revolutionary and cleansing, and then there would be a bad violence which is just perpetuating oppression. But it's the ends that allow us to distinguish the means and to judge the means, or it's rather the very positionality of the partisan standpoint. I don't know, maybe we'll talk about standpoint, but it's when violence is conjured from the perspective of the partisan, that violence is actually qualitatively different and justified and cleansing and revolutionary. So isn't the partisan standpoint the one that justifies, I was saying, the means and the ends, rather than simply, thinking that the ends justify the means?
Yes, I think so. And I also think that Benjamin extends the concept of violence to things that are considered nonviolent. So when he talks about nonviolence, he says, well, what about nonviolence? And he says, well, nonviolence is always based on compromise. It's like, well, I wish I could have done it, but I couldn't. So there's an inherent sort of threat of violence, even in nonviolence. And the comparison could also be with Gandhi, right? So Gandhi is advocating nonviolence in anti-colonial struggle, and he thinks that passive resistance, nonviolence, are a way to defeat the colonizer because they are using instruments that the colonizer has not used. So apparently it's almost like an opposite argument to that of Fanon. But I think Benjamin would say, no, wait, like nonviolence, not paying your taxes, is a form of violence against the colonial state. So it is absolutely the positionality. It is absolutely the positionality. It is what the political combatant, as opposed to the regular army, right? So again, sorry again to harp on about the Battle of Algiers, but you see the regular army, you understand this as violence. And when you see the young boy killing the policeman in the back, you have a different impression. It is dialectical for sure. Like, you cannot understand the ethicality of one without the other. No, but anyway, but it's
No, I agree. Like, I'm just tired and starting to lose lucidity in concept. Sorry if I look like a minute.
So,
See, we have
10 minutes break?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.